Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of Sisreads, 姐姐好读. This is a show on female authors and readers. As the title Sisreads suggests, it's just like a cozy chat between sisters. I'm Xixi, the moderator of today's episode. I'm joined by Xiaojiao, who's a co-host and also a scholar in comparative literature. And today we have a very special guest, Paige Aniyah Morris, a literary translator who co-translated Han Kang's latest novel, We Do Not Part, into English. In a previous episode of Sisreads, we discussed Han Kang's other book, The Vegetarian. We loved the book, but also had a lot of questions. So it's great to have someone who's much more familiar with her work here in the room with us. Paige, welcome to Sisreads. Can you briefly introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I am a literary translator from Korean. I translate into English, and I am also a writer. I'm also currently a PhD student studying translation of Black American literature into Korean. So all of my interests kind of overlap with like Korean culture, how it ties into identity. And I am the co-translator of Han Kang's novel and also some other works of fiction, usually by women, a lot of speculative fiction. I am so excited again to be here. It's my first time in Shanghai, and I'm really glad to be talking about Han Kang's work.
Thank you for agreeing to be on our show at such short notice.
Of course.
Xiaojiao, do you want to also briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, so you know me as Xiaojiao, who don't know about love. But today I'm so happy to have Paige being here, and we will discuss the Hong Kong a little bit in our previous episode. And hopefully with a translator being here, we could explore more aspects of her work and talk more about the translation of Hong Kong's work and the circulation of her work around the world today.
So today we'll be diving into Paige's journey as a translator, the challenges of interpreting Han Kang's work, and the broader landscape of contemporary Korean literature. So let's start from the beginning. Paige, how did you first encounter Han Kang's work? What's your Han Kang reading journey been like?
Yeah, so actually I first encountered Han Kang in translation through Deborah Smith's translation of The Vegetarian. And then from there, I started going on a deep dive of her Korean bibliography just because at that time, pretty much nothing had been translated into English before Deborah brought along The Vegetarian. So I was fascinated by the reaction to it in English and reading it in English, and it inspired me to kind of go into a deep dive. And that's when I became a fan of Han Kang, the writer herself. So reading her Korean novels, I started really anticipating when the English translations would come out so I had more people to discuss them with, because she's just a really fascinating writer in Korean and so different, I think, from a lot of the Korean authors who are kind of her contemporaries. Yeah.
It must be really exciting to actually bring her new work into the English audiences.
Yes, I think there's like this ascended fangirl feeling where you start off being such an admirer of someone and thinking you would never have the skill or the opportunity to work on a novel by someone of her caliber, and then suddenly the opportunity comes up, and I was really glad to take it, but also terrified, obviously, once I figured out I would be working on a novel by someone I admired so much.
Yeah, I've read some reviews about the translation of We Do Not Part, and it's really raving praise of it. So you must have done a really good job. Congratulations for the completion of the book and also the publication of it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a long time coming. It took us quite a while, and I know a lot of people were getting a bit antsy because the Korean novel came out in 2021, actually. The following year, Emily, my co-translator, and I started working on the translation, but in that time, it's taken so long to get to publication, and so many people have been kind of hankering to read it, so I'm glad it's out there, and I'm glad the response has been so positive.
Yeah, so going back to your Han Kang's reading journey, was it love at first read, or did her style take time to grow on you?
For me, it was love at first read just because it was so difficult, I think, to get into her work. It's just so different from just reading, I think, a lot of what was on the bookshelves or what's really accessible, what people tend to choose to translate is usually more straightforward or realist, contemporary fiction. But Han Kang was always writing at a level that was like a bit different or a bit above. So even though there are interpretations of some of her works that would say they're more realist or more straightforward for a Han Kang novel, even then there's always like a twist. There's always some element of like fantasy or something ambiguous in the novel that kind of defies like a straightforward reading experience. So you would also see parts of her novels where she would suddenly kind of break into verse. So a paragraph would turn into like lines of poetry. And she started off as a poet, actually, so you can see that influence come through. She's also recorded an album of songs. So she has like this musicality to her work that comes in. She's done kind of video installations and media art as well. So all of these disciplines show up in her novels and make them so different from any other novel you would see in Korean literature. So it was kind of just shocking to see someone writing like that and to see it be so well received, I think. So from the start, I was fascinated by her as a writer, but I also can't say it was like I could just dive in and like easily consume all her books in a day or something. It took time to read each of them.
Yeah, I think you summarized my feeling when I first read The Vegetarian so well, so eloquently, because I feel like it's kind of confusing sometimes and also so fascinating at other times. So it's like you couldn't really just figure out how you are reacting to the text.
Yeah.
What was your Han Kang reading journey like, Xiaojiao?
I also first read The Vegetarian, the Deborah Smith's translation of it, and it was like a very interesting reading. I recently read the Chinese version of it, and the experience is so different. The English version, like you said, is more poetic. I can feel the rhythm in it. It's more musical. The Chinese version, I think, is more cruel. I don't know if the dealing of the language or if the English version has transformed some of the parts into a different visceral imagery in comparison to the Chinese version. But my first experience and impression of her is also poetic, I think. And to some extent, we talked about it, we felt like the English version is more allegorical in comparison to the Chinese version. So I have a question, a quick one. So if you were to use one word to describe the Korean language used by Han Kang, because we don't know Korean, so we talk about the novel in terms of the content, but because you're expert in the language, what would you say the Korean language used by Han Kang?
Like her style in
The
Korean.
style in Korean. Or a phrase.
I think a phrase would be
Yeah.
easier. I would say like a fairy tale, I think. Yeah. So
love
I lean a bit more toward the kind of allegorical readings of her work. And I think, again, she's fascinating because she does do very straightforward writing in places, but there are so many parts of her novels where she breaks from that and it kind of calls into question, right? How should we read this? Is this real? Is this really happening? Is this just a moment of poetry, a moment of like stream of consciousness coming through? And it'll happen just in the middle of a paragraph, so you really don't know, like, where are these breaks? How should I read this? And I think that ambiguity is present in her writing and in the Korean language in general. So it's really interesting to think about how a different translator, maybe in trying to make sense of it themselves, is applying their interpretation to their translation and kind of making it a bit more palpable, like something that you can actually like understand, because that's the translator grappling with it too.
Yeah, I love the word, the phrase, fairy tale, and also the atmosphere. The phrase captures the atmosphere of me reading The Vegetarian, and some parts of We Do Not Part, it's kind of like not that realistic as in the Chinese translation.
Yeah, because we cannot read the original version in Korean. So we were trying to compare the English translation and the Chinese translation. And when we were reading English version, it feels more allegorical. It feels like a parable. But when we're reading the Chinese version, I don't know if it's because like the country context, kind of Asian context is closer. It feels like so realistic and so raw, and it's so emotionally intense. When I was reading that, I feel like it could be a story that happened to some people that I know in my real life. I don't know if that feeling is accurate, but yeah, that's a question I want to pose to two translators in the room, right? Like, can the same book feel so differently in different languages?
I think absolutely. I really think in translation, often the translator becomes invisible and we don't really think about their impact on the book. And we're trying to treat it as though we're getting the exact version that was published in the original language. But I think it's inevitable that the translator kind of infuses something of their own style or something of their own reading into the translation. So even for myself, a lot of the time I would doubt my reading of a passage, or I have my theory, and it's like it's different when you're translating the book, because you can't just throw out theories and see what sticks. You have to actually try to understand and convey it as clearly as you can. So I would come to my co-translator with my theories, and she would say either, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way, or agreeing with my theory. And so I would think, okay, are we accurate? Are we like getting to the pulse of it? Then we would bring a question to the writer, and often her answers were kind of like, it's up to you. It's up to your interpretation. But sometimes she would kind of be a bit more explicit about saying, like, this is what I intended. And in those moments, I realized as readers, we're all going to have our own interpretations. And if we're not in conversation with the writer of the original work, we can never truly 100% know the writer's intentions as best as we try. So I think for each translator, it's kind of a struggle of, do we want to impose our reading and our interpretation on the translation, or do we want to kind of pull back as much as possible and leave it to the reader? So I think some translators will take a bit more of an intensive, like a little bit more of an invasive style, some would say, and others will kind of just, leave almost everything up to interpretation that can be left up to interpretation.